Hey friends, welcome to the Empowered Homes Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to grow strong families by connecting church and home. I'm joined in studio with Megan. Megan.
Hey friends.
We are sitting on Zoom with our new friend, Vince Miller. Vince, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today. Love hearing your voices. So let's see what God has for us, huh?
Yeah, super excited. We're going to talk about all things in your life, but just for our audience, Vince is the author of over 20 books, speaker nationwide, and founder of the men's ministry platform Resolute. Vince, so grateful for you and just what you do in your ministry to go after the heart of men. But for those listeners, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your family. Just who are you, man?
Yeah, so I grew up on the West Coast. San Francisco is where my early home was. Was raised by my grandfather, actually, after my bio and stepdads left. And eventually met Jesus Christ because of my grandfather. Went off to college in Oklahoma, met the love of my life, my wife down there. And then she dragged me off to the frozen tundra of Minnesota for the next 27 years. We raised our 3 children there. All of them are out of the house now. One is married and we have 1 grandchild. Currently, my wife is a designer, a home designer. So she's had a very successful business for a couple dozen years. And I have worked in ministry for about 30 years or so, and it's been a blast. And of course, at present, over the last decade, I've been working specifically with men because of this real strong call to men because of my grandfather's influence in my life. So that's kind of the short story to this point, but it's been a blast.
Man, we're so grateful for you giving us some time today and, hearing about your kids and your grandkids. So do you have a granddad name or are you just grandpa?
Well, my son-in-law has tried to call me VPaw. I've resisted that a little bit. My wife calls me Pops, but I figured I would just let the grandchild decide. I mean, whatever comes out of his mouth is what I'm going to respond to. So eventually when he starts chirping out some words, we'll find out what he has to say. Great question, though.
Yeah, well, that's always an intriguing question. There was this season of grandparents like, I don't want to be a grandma or granddad. Like, I want to be Mimi or, some cute name. Like, I'm not that old, but I think we're kind of drifting back. Like, I want my grandkids to call me like grandpapa or something like super old fashioned. Like, but that's awesome, man. Thank you. Being in ministry and your heart for men. Before we get in the book, like you mentioned your own grandpa. What was the moment where you're like, man, God has called me to go after the heart of men? What was that moment for you? And what started this whole path for you to really want to reach out and go after men?
Yeah. So my mom and dad were married when they were pretty young. Dad went off to Vietnam, came back pretty damaged from that experience, addicted to drugs, had a pretty hard life after that. My mom and him divorced, and he was a rough guy. He's long gone. So is my mother, just a lot of bad choices in their life. But there was kind of this mystery, I think, that I had in my young teens about my bio dad. I think we all kind of have these moments that we see something in our biological father and it's mysterious to us and we want to know more. So I had one of those moments when I was about 10 or so. And here's what happened. I went to my mom one day and I just said, I want to spend more time with dad. And she was kind of shocked at my question because obviously she knew things about my father that I didn't even understand at age 10. And so I pestered her about, her talking with my father about me spending more time with him. Well, at that time they were divorced and it was kind of a bloody divorce and it was just really messy. And so my dad only got every other weekend with me. So I would go over to fun dad's house every weekend and hang out with him, and then come back to disciplined mom's house. And, I just kept pestering my mom and pestering my mom. Finally, she caved one day and she said, fine, I'll talk to him when he drops you back off at home. So I go to his house for the weekend, kind of excited about the trip home. I get out of my dad's white Ford Bronco.
Hey,
the O.J. Simpson Bronco, by the way. And I get out of the truck and I walk toward the door. My mom comes out to meet us and she tells me to go into the house. And of course, this was kind of intriguing to me because I had never seen my mom and dad physically together ever in my life. So I ran into the house, ran around the back of the house, came out the side where the garage was, and I listened in and I watched my mom lean into the window. They kind of had a conversation. It went on for a little bit, maybe 5 minutes or so. And then it got heated. Then there was an argument. And then I heard these words. My father said to my mother, I don't want to spend time with him. You spend time with him. And then he drove off. Mm-hmm. Now, to say the least, that was the last time I ever actually spoke to my father. I never went back over to his house. My mom never knew that I heard that. I just went back in and she told me it's not going to happen. I said, fine, I don't want to go back over there. I never did. Anyway, that left a pretty deep wound on my life. Then she went through a second husband, and then she just came to me one day and said, I'm not going to marry anymore. I can see it's really affecting you. And it was, by this time I'm about 15 years old. I don't have a man in my life. I'm feeling kind of lost. I'm feeling aimless. And then one day, my grandfather, so this is for grandfathers listening right now, my grandfather came over to my mom's house and sat down and had a little talk with my mom. And essentially what he said to my mom was, I want to implore you to allow Vince to come over and live at our house. I think it would be good if he kind of witnessed a man regularly involved in his life. And I kind of listened into that conversation too. And she caved. She kind of handed me over to my grandfather at that moment. I moved into his house, spent some time with him, and they raised me for the next, few years. It was my grandfather's influence in my life that really has stirred all this. I mean, Bobby, Megan, I think we underestimate the influence of a grandfather in our life. But my grandfather was a godly man, retired military veteran, did one thing every day except on Thursdays, which was golf, and didn't golf on Thursdays because it was Women's Day, which we heard about every Thursday. And he just poured into me. I learned very basic lessons from him, like things like manners at a table, how to treat a woman, how to drive a car, how to shave. And there were so many lessons that he taught me that today I spend most of my time speaking and teaching on topics related to Christianity and masculinity and manhood based upon the lessons I learned from my grandfather. One of those moments was had in his old 58 Chevy pickup. He was teaching me how to drive on that old big manual steering truck, and we were just sitting side by side one day and he says, hey, I want to have a conversation with you. And he said, you need to hear this. He says, your mom and dad say God is not real because Christians are hypocrites and the church is full of broken people. And then he paused and he just said, I want you to know they're right. The church is full of broken people and Christians can be hypocrites. And I'm both those things, a broken man and a hypocrite at times. He says, but you need to know, I don't put my faith in the church or in broken people. I put my faith in a man who is broken for me, and his name is Jesus. Mm. And that short little conversation turned a world of mistaken understanding about Jesus and the church right side up for me and influenced me for the kingdom. And so really from moments like that I had with my grandfather, I felt inspired to do the same for other men in this life so that they might know the man Jesus Christ. So that's a little bit of just a short little snippet of backstory there for you.
Yeah, I love that, man. And, in the book, Essential Elements, Forging Godly Men, this is volume 1 in a three volume series. Man, share with us, thank you for sharing one, just kind of your story, a little bit of your heart, but share with us, about this series and then the overall mission of like, what do you see God doing through this already, and what's your hope for it?
Yeah, so it's a 3-part series. It's 3 books, about 6 lessons in each. I just kind of wanted to boil 3 aspects of manhood down for men. So this first book, Essential Elements, is the gospel for men. The second book is disciplines for men. The third book is leadership for men. In the first book here, it's really just the gospel for men. And I think men fail to really understand the message of the gospel. It feels very intangible, very subjective, I think, to some men. They understand when they experience it, but they don't know how to articulate it. And so what I do in this first book is I explain essentially the gospel story through a man's lens. So it goes like this. This would be a 1-minute overview. In the beginning, God created man. He was perfect. Chapter 3, we blow it all. The rest of the Old Testament is the story of God looking for a man. God gets mildly irritated with us because, well, he can't find a man. So he self-provides his own man, his son, Jesus Christ. And in that man, Jesus, we see the perfect man, absolutely perfect. Everything that God wanted us to be back in Genesis, Jesus is. Not only that, Jesus lives, dies, raises again to restore us to the man that God designed us to be, so that we might become the men he wants us to be. So that's essentially the story of the first book through the lens of a man. And the way that I do this is like I already have with you, I share stories from my life. I share stories from God's word, and then I help them to see their own story and how that's shaped through their life, so they can articulate that story to other people. Because not only is, I think, sometimes the gospel story kind of hard to grasp for people, but it's also hard to communicate unless we have it presented very simply. And so what I'm trying to do is help guys to get a hold of that story, have conversations with other men about that story, so they can communicate it to future generations, including your own families.
Yeah, that's so good. And, I love that your ministry is, you've written a lot of books, and you have a lot of influence amongst many men, and you have devotionals online, and you're really just passionate about pouring into and directing men specifically to God's word. And, you tell a little bit about how it was your grandfather that was so influential in that. But I'm curious about, when you still kind of had to reconcile just kind of maybe your feelings towards your dad and maybe even your mom too, but how did you get to a place where you went from hearing about Jesus and then going into a place of ministry? But what did that look like, that journey in there, sort of maybe processing through some of that grief or trying to figure out, like, how do I move forward and still, reconcile these relationships that I have or that are broken? What did that look like for you?
Again, that's a great and thoughtful question. Thank you for asking it. So I could share with you a ton of stories on, I think, some of the emotions I went through, the challenges I went through, and some of the reconciliation, but there's probably one that captures it best. So a number of years ago, my mom passed away. She died actually of a meth overdose, heart attack induced from a meth overdose. And, growing up, she had a beautiful home in California. We weren't poor. We were somewhat well-to-do. She had a beautiful home in kind of the hills looking out toward the bay. And, she died, and I made a trip out there, and I was going to kind of put a pin on her funeral and then, clean up her house and get it ready for sale. So I did. The house sold in an hour, of course, and it was worth a ton of money. And I packed up a few of her possessions and made a trip back across the U.S. And at the time, I was actually living in Texas, north of you guys in Fort Worth. And after being home a few days, I got a call on the phone. I was out in my front yard. I was mowing. I got a call on my phone, and I answered, and it was my father who I had not talked to since that incident. So it's been 25 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm standing in my front lawn and I can tell it's him because you can tell I have a distinct voice. He does too. It sounds just like me. So he was on the phone. He began to talk. I could tell quickly he was inebriated or high. And he began to engage me in a conversation. And he just started off with something like, "Hey, heard your mom died, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, just out at the funeral, et cetera, et cetera. Got some things kind of together, did the funeral, came home, et cetera." And then he stopped me and he says, "The reason why I'm calling is I heard you sold the house." And I went, "Yeah, sold the house." He goes, "Well, I expect you to pay me back for all the years of child support and alimony that I wrote to your mom, because all that money was mine."
Wow.
And I was like, I was literally in shock. I was like,
Wow.
This is the conversation we're going to have.
Right.
And I replied to him. I said, "Seriously, that's why you called?" And then I said, in short, I said, "Dad, do me a favor. Don't ever call here ever again." And I just hung up the phone. And I went in and I talked with my wife. And, I'm a pastor. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I kind of had second thoughts about what I'd said to him, and the way I kind of let it go. I didn't speak any vulgar words or anything. I just said, "Please do me a favor, never call here ever again," and hung up the phone. And yet still, I kind of regretted what I said. I felt it was still dishonoring, even though he was not being clearly a very honoring man at that moment either. So anyway, I started to write a letter to him. And I started to type it up on the computer, et cetera, et cetera. And I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I was just pouring out my feelings, right? And Megan, no kidding, one of my friends from Texas, a lawyer, found out what had happened and said, "Hey, Vince, before you send off that letter," he says, "could you do me a favor? Could you print it out and let's meet?" And I said, "Sure." So we met at a local breakfast joint. He bought me breakfast. I sat there. We had a short conversation. I brought the letter with me. It's 2 pages long. He says, "So would you mind, Vince, if I read that letter?" And I pushed it across the table to him, and he just put his hands on it like any good lawyer. Didn't even look down at it, and looked at me and said, "Would you mind if I take some time to read it?" And I said, "Sure." And I was kind of waiting for him to read it right then, but he didn't, And then he takes it back to his office, and it takes him multiple days to get back to me. I think it was like 4 or 5 days. I was really anxious to hear, but he took his time. And then he read it, and he called me up and he said, "Hey, I read your letter. Would you like to know what I think?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, let's meet for breakfast again." I'm like, okay. At this point, I'm wondering if I'm going to get a bill or something. And anyway, he brings the letter to the breakfast again, and he pushes it across the table, and it's got all this red ink all over it. And he pushes it across me. He says, "I don't want you to read it now, but when you get home, read it. I made a few edits for you to consider, and then consider the edits, and then rewrite, and then let's talk about it again." So I went home and immediately read it, of course, because I was curious. And dude, he had marked up this thing like crazy. And I was like, okay, I could see what he was doing. So I rewrote the letter within about an hour and sent it back to him. He says, a couple of days later, he goes, "I got it." He said, "Let me read it over and then let's meet again." I'm like, "Are we really going to do this again?" And so about a week later, we met again for breakfast. He pushes it back across the table. It's got more red ink on it. And I'm like, "You got to be kidding me." So anyway, I went home, I made some more edits, and then I sent it back to him one last time. And then he says, "Well, let's meet for breakfast again." And there we are, sitting for breakfast the third time. He's got it underneath his hands there. I could see it under his hands. And he pushes it across the table, and he doesn't take his hand off of it. And he says, "Vince, I'm going to give this back to you." He says, "But here's what I want you to do." He says, "I want you to tear this thing up in front of me and delete it from your computer when you get home." He says, "Because you know your father's not going to receive it. What you need to do is forgive him." And that was easily the most incredible exercise I've ever done in reconciling hurts and pains with my father. I don't even remember exactly what I said, but he finally got my apology right, or helped me to get my apology right. But what he was trying to teach me was it wasn't about what I was saying to my father. It's about what I needed to do within my own heart.
Yeah.
And profound moment, Megan, just one of many where I had to learn to reconcile with my father. But I think it's absolutely critical that we get an understanding of that. But that isn't the most important father we got to reconcile with.
Mm-hmm.
The most important father we got to reconcile with is God the Father, who, by the way, is the one we have actually offended with our sin, who is the only pure, righteous, and holy one. And if we can reconcile with him, a righteous one, then we can reconcile with anyone else in our life, because it's out of his forgiveness and his grace and his mercy that we are allowed to be forgiven. And if we can receive his forgiveness, then, you know, I can learn to forgive those around me who have, you know, hurt me.
Yeah, man. Thank you for sharing that. Just a powerful story. You know, what we tell our men here all the time is, you know, when we allow God to start putting meaning to our story, we got to stop blaming. And we can't blame. But when we put meaning to it and allow him to bring that redemption and that healing and that freedom into those hard spots, and then we get to receive that forgiveness and extend that forgiveness, and we get to receive that grace and that peace that only he, our Father in heaven, can provide, man. It's just a powerful testimony of God working in and through you, and just so grateful for all the men you impact. Going back to your book, you know, our culture today, we could probably spend hours and hours and hours looking at, you know, the cultural definition of masculinity and just all the different things that we're struggling with, our society struggling with, that we look at and it's like, why are we struggling with these things? But in your book, you say that the essence of genuine manhood is rooted in the timeless wisdom of the Bible. How does the life of Jesus provide the model for masculinity? Because a lot of people will say, well, Jesus was like, he didn't look very masculine, that the world would say. Like, how do you teach Jesus being the model for masculinity today, and what we should be striving to be as men?
Yeah, a couple of things as I answer that question, just to kind of set the mindset and a biblical perspective on it. First thing is this: you know, I believe masculinity is mostly a social construct. It's something, masculinity is constantly changing and being understood within society based upon sociological interactions. Okay, so that's my viewpoint. That's how I explain it. Manhood, on the other hand, is very different. And I have a very unique perspective on it that I think people today really need to have if they're followers of Jesus Christ. And it goes like this. Simple logic would say, if you want to understand something that's created, just anything that's created, you would go back to the creator of that thing to understand that thing. Well, it's pretty simple. Based upon what the Bible says, God created the first man and woman. He clearly created them very good. So if you want to understand something that's created, just go back to God to understand man, because God created him. He had a purpose and an intent for them. Therefore, when I'm reading the gospel story or just anything throughout the Bible, I'm reading with a lens for an understanding of manhood. And for me, Jesus Christ is the perfect depiction of manhood. Manhood, based upon a biblical understanding, is everything that Jesus was. I mean, if you want to understand masculinity, go to the world. If you want to understand manhood or real biblical manhood, you just have to go back to the man to understand the manhood. Because, well, God understood that we didn't understand it. So he sent us a man to model for men what it's supposed to look like. And he walked and he talked with them every day, showing them what it looked like. And it looked very contrary to the things of this world. And, he points those out so that we can kind of understand it. Now, I always believe that biblical manhood and masculinity, as defined by this word, are always going to be in conflict. Always. There's always going to be a new idea, a new understanding. We can complain about that all day long, or we can go to the Bible to get instructions on how to be a man of God and follow the man of God so that we can be the man that God designed us to be. And I think that's the simplest way to put it. That way, I think if we can understand it that way, then we're going to run to the Bible for answers to those things.
Dang. That's well said, my friend.
Yes,
yeah, very good. I didn't know how you're going to take that, because you can unpack that world masculinity worldview in so many different ways. But what a simple yet profound way of looking at manhood, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, and Bobby and I joked before we got on the podcast, because I was like, I don't even know if I should be joining this podcast because y'all are talking about manhood, and I mean, should I be here? However, I have a 14-year-old young man, and I pray that he will grow up to be a godly man. But I really, for moms, which we have a lot of moms who listen, for moms who have sons, practically speaking, like boiling it down to some practical tips, what would you say to those mamas who want to promote healthy masculinity in their young sons, particularly when they're being so influenced and attacked by online voices and social media, and even peers at school or just out in the world? Like, what are some practical tips for moms to kind of guide their sons towards biblical masculinity?
Well, Megan, I'm glad you're here. First off, you should be here, by the way. And I think sometimes yeah, exactly. And by the way, I think women, wives, and mothers really want to hear answers to these things. They want to figure out how they can become a part of the story, how they can help. And, Megan, honestly, we're always being discipled, right? We're always being discipled. And I think mothers have to be a voice into that. One thing I think a great mother can do is point to a great man, right? She can catch a great man doing something and say, did you see what he did? Because we need role models, number one. And sometimes we need to point out the wrong things that they do and the right things that they do. So as a mama of a 14-year-old boy, right now in that boy's life, I'm going to tell you, he's hearing all kinds of things from all of his friends. And if you're not speaking to him, he's going to listen to all those other voices. Here's an example of it, not to scare you today, okay? I remember I grew up in California, so in the Bay Area. And I remember when I was in junior high, about 12 or so, I was standing around on the basketball court waiting for gym class to begin. So me and a group of my friends went to the locker room, and back then you would put on these stinky gym clothes that you didn't wash for half of a year, right? You put them on, you come out to the basketball court, getting ready for class. And we had this gym teacher who was notoriously late for class, always late every single time. So everybody is ready to go for gym class. We're standing there with our stinky gear on. We have no basketballs or nothing. And we're just standing around having conversations that we probably shouldn't have. Well, there was a boy walking past class that day that was a friend of ours. He saw the coach wasn't there and knew he was late. So he came in and started talking with us, and he huddles around four of us. And we kind of get in this little huddle together, and he leans in and he goes, "Guys, did you hear what Tony did with the girl over at his house over the weekend?" And no kidding, he begins to tell us about this friend named Tony. His parents are gone. He has a girl over. They're playing house. All right, that's probably enough detail. But he told us everything in about 5 minutes that Tony did with this girl, at least hearsay. And he was a little bit of a gossip, so we're all listening in. And this was long before internet, cell phones. I mean, the only way we got pornography when we were a kid is a paperback magazine. Okay, so we're learning is what we're doing. We're being discipled. And this boy, while he's telling the story, kind of finishing up, coach walks into class, yells a few choice words to this kid, tells him to get out of class. And this boy he backs away from our group and he looks at each one of us in the eyes, and with the most stunning and shocking glare, he says, "Well, guys, I guess Tony became a man. Tony became a man." And I'm going to tell you, we all believed him. We believed that we had to do something to become a man, and that thing was obvious. And, because I didn't have a father in my life at that time, I fell for it.
Sure.
That is how powerful the voices are in this life. There's always people discipling us. So one thing I would absolutely say to moms is, like, look, you got to be talking about these things. You got to be pointing out respectful views of manhood, biblical views of manhood that you see around you, and things that manhood are not. Be constantly teaching. Second, I'll give you another one. You really got to encourage young men, I think, to be in community with other godly men, whether that be a pastor or a coach or a family friend or a grandfather, right? Encourage them to spend time with godly men. I would encourage you to pay for those experiences if you have to.
Yeah.
Like if you need to send them on a summer camp so they're around godly men, if you need to send them on an experience with your grandfather to be around godly men, whatever it is, encourage that. A couple of other things, just keep it short, but I think you got to pray for your kid boldly. The power of a praying mother is incredible. Like, I think we should be praying for, and it's not just a mother, a father too, but we should be praying specifically for them and then over them. One of the things I do all the time is I actually pick up my phone and I text my kids, even though they're gone from the house. I text my kids, and once in a while I hit the record button on there and I'll record a prayer that I send to them. They don't get a choice of whether or not they're going to listen to it. I send it to them. And then once in a while, I know, whether they're listening or not. So those are a few small things that I think that maybe moms, women, wives can do even today for any young man or adult man in your house to help get them to kind of track. You got to always be discipling and always be talking about Jesus.
Yeah, I love that point of surrounding your kids with other men. I want to be the greatest influence on my boys. I got two, but we try to do intentional things. I go on a hunting trip annually. I guess we've been going the last 4 years, and I tell the other two dads, so it's 2 dads and 5 boys, and I tell the other 2 dads, I said, hey, I'm going to at least 2 times this weekend say something or speak life into your boys, and I want you to do the same for mine. And it's been such a cool tradition that we have. And the last night, before we leave, we sit around the dinner table, and we get to just bless those boys and pour into them and just encourage them. But also, I want those other 2 dads to speak into my kid's life, and I want to speak into their boys' life. And that's been such a powerful tool that we've used with allowing other men to speak in the lives of our kids and having that, because I trust those men, and they treat them like they're their own kids, and I do the same for them. But man, hey, thank you so much for your time today. The book is the first of 3 volumes, Essential Elements, Forging Godly Men. If folks listening, like, man, I want to know more about Vince, where can they find information about you and grab a copy of this?
Yeah, just go to vincemiller.com. Just type in my name, you'll find me. I'd love to have people sign up for our daily devotional. It's listened by a lot of people worldwide. I have a Monday show, too, that I do once a week for guys called The Vince Miller Show. As you can see, we spent a lot of money on a marketing budget to try to figure out what the name should be. Yeah. So anyway, I'd love to have people listen to that. But that's just type in vincemiller.com. You'll find me. And you can pick up a copy of the book if you want.
vincemiller.com. We can get a hold of you. That's pretty easy.
It's easy to remember. And I got to say, you got some real cool swag on there. So, that hat, I saw that hat, plus all the sweatshirts. I'm tempted to go back on and buy some, just so you know.
We'll send you one. How about that?
That works too.
Yeah, that works. Always good to have swag. Man, thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing for our men. And I know for sure that this is going to bless so many guys that go in. And the crazy part about our ministry, crazy part about your ministry is you may never know. You may never know the impact that you are making. You may never know all the stories, but I just want to say on behalf of what you may never know, I want to say thank you, man. Thank you for pouring your heart and your life into just loving men and pointing them towards the greatest man that ever lived. So appreciate you, man.